buried her mother alone at 10 and worked ever since. A Lakota chief set her by his fire. The first thing I remember about her is her hands. Not her face, not the story Heron Wing brought me, riding in from the river crossing with snow on his blanket and ice in his beard. Not the way she stood in the open flap of my lodge, the wind coming off the northern plains hard enough to bow the lodgepoles. Her hands, knuckles raw, skin cracked at the joints the way skin gets when a person has worked in cold water since before they were big enough to lift what they were washing. I am an old man now. I have seen many things. But when I close my eyes and pull her back, I still see those hands first. They told me everything, more than any story. She was maybe 22, maybe 23. She did not know exactly, and she said so without shame, which told me something else about her. Her mother had been Lakota, a woman from the Miniconjou, taken by a white trader when she was herself very young. Her father was that trader, and when she was 10 he took a fever and died at his post on the White River, and her mother followed him 3 days later, and Wikapi, that was what her mother had named her, Star, buried them both herself. Or near enough. She dragged her father outside and covered him with stones from the riverbed, because she was too small to dig frozen ground, and she sat with her mother until the breathing stopped, and then she wrapped her in a blanket and did the same. After that she worked. She worked at the post for the next trader who came through, washing his clothes and cooking his beans. She worked for the family of a Yankton headman who found her living alone in the empty post that first spring, nearly starved. She worked for a road ranch outside Fort Randall, washing, mending, hauling water. She was not a woman who had ever stopped. I did not know all of this when Heron Wing brought her to me. I learned it piece by piece over the following weeks, not because she told it as a story, but because pieces of it came out the way splinters work their way out of wood in the cold, pushed up slowly, appearing where you did not expect them. What Heron Wing told me was simpler. He told me a young woman was working herself to death at the Blackwood trading post, 9 miles east. He told me the man there, a trader named Caswell, worked her from before light to after dark for almost nothing, kept her from leaving by saying she owed him for her food, and that she had made no complaint to anyone. He told me one of our young men had seen her carrying a barrel of frozen meat across the yard in the dark, alone, and that when she fell and the barrel rolled and she lay there in the snow with her face against the ground, she had not cried out. She had simply gotten back up. That last part was what made Heron Wing ride to me instead of letting it go. I had been chief of this band for 19 years. I had buried 2 wives and 4 children and more warriors than I could carry in my chest without it weighing me down to the ground. I was 56 years old. My hair had gone gray at the temples, and I had a bad knee that spoke to me plainly every morning, the way an honest man will tell you hard things before he tells you easy ones. I was not a young man looking for softness in the world, but I listened to what Heron Wing said, and I was quiet for a long moment, and then I told him to saddle 2 horses. We rode out the next morning, before the sun was above the hills. Caswell was a wide man with small eyes and a way of smiling that had nothing behind it. He came out of his post when he heard our horses, and he smiled that smile, and I looked past him to where a woman was standing at the woodpile with an axe in her hands. She had heard us too. She was still watching. The axe was held down at her side, not threatening, just carried, the way a person carries something they have held so long they forget it is in their hand. I told Caswell I had come for the woman. He said she was not for sale. I told him I had not offered to buy her. His smile went away. What followed was not long, and it was not complicated. I am a chief. I have behind me a lifetime of making plain to men what I mean without raising my voice. There is a way of standing and a way of looking at a man that tells him you have already decided what will happen, and you are simply waiting for him to reach the same conclusion. Caswell reached it. He talked for a while first about what she owed him, about what her labor was worth, about how he was entitled to compensation, about how things worked out here. I let him talk. When he was done, I asked him once if he had anything more to say. He didn't. I nodded. I walked to the woodpile. She had not moved. She was watching me come with dark eyes that gave nothing away, and the axe was still loose in her hand. Her face was thin. She had her mother's high bones across the cheek and her father's coloring, lighter than mine, and she had been out in the cold so long her lips were cracked at the corners. She looked at me without fear and without hope, which was the look of a person who had learned that neither one bought you much. I told her she could come with us or stay. That it was her choice, and I would not make it for her. She asked where. I told her the camp, 9 miles west. She asked what she would do there. I told her whatever needed doing, the same work but for her own people. I looked at her hands when I said it, and then I looked back at her face. I said, "You have worked long enough for men who owe you." She did not say anything to that. But she put the axe against the woodpile, carefully, and she went to the door of the post and came back with a blanket roll that was everything she owned in the world, and she stood at the horses and waited. Heron Wing looked at me over his horse's neck. I said nothing. I helped her up. The ride back was cold, and the sky was that particular white it gets in deep winter when the light is flat and directionless, and the snow on the plains looks like it has always been there and always will be. She rode behind me without talking. Once, about halfway back, she asked me my name. I told her. She said it once quietly, the way you learn a word in a language you are not sure you will ever speak again, and then she was quiet for the rest of the ride. She had been in the camp 2 days before anyone knew what to make of her. My sister brought down the eagle, watched her with narrow eyes the first morning when she came out before dawn, and began hauling water without being asked. By the second day brought down, the eagle had stopped watching and simply told her where things needed to go, and by the third she was talking to her the way she talked to everyone she liked, which is to say plainly and with some sharpness, because my sister had never learned to soften things and saw no reason to start. Wickupi received this without blinking, which told brought down the eagle something, and by the end of the first week she had, in my sister's way, simply decided that Wickupi belonged. The children found her more easily. Children always do. Within 3 days there were 2 boys following her when she walked to the water, and a girl who attached herself to Wickupi's side at mealtimes, with that absolute certainty small children have when they have decided about a person. Wickupi did not talk much to any of them, but she was never sharp, never impatient, and when the little girl, she was maybe 5, the daughter of a warrior I had lost 2 summers ago, fell into the snowbank by the lodge entrance and came up wailing, Wickupi picked her up without hurrying and held her against her chest and walked slowly, just walked, until the crying stopped, and the child fell asleep against her collarbone before they had gone 20 steps. I watched that from across the camp. I watched a good many things from across the camp in those first weeks. It was not a thing I had planned or thought about. It was more that I noticed when she was in my line of sight and noticed a little differently when she was not. What I saw was a woman who had been worked down to the bone and was slowly, carefully finding out what she was like when she was not working only to survive. It was like watching something unclench, not all at once. It happened in small pieces, the way she began to stop before she entered her lodge and look at the sky for a moment, just look, not as though she were looking for weather but as though she had remembered she was allowed to. The way she began to eat fully at meals, instead of taking less than her share, as though she expected to have to give some of it back. The way she told one of the boys a thing about his knot. He had been trying to tie off a bundle wrong for 10 minutes. Not apologetically, the way someone says something uncertain, but just straight, because she knew it and he didn't. She knew a great many things. This surprised some of my people and did not surprise me. A woman who has worked every day since she was 10 years old in rough country learns what works and what doesn't, and she learns it the way you only learn things that cost you something when you get them wrong. She could stretch a hide. She knew which roots under the snow could be dug in early winter and what they were good for. She could look at a horse going lame and put her hand right to the place. I did not talk with her much in those first weeks. I was aware of a thing in myself that told me to be careful, and I respected it enough to listen to it. I had been alone since my second wife died, 7 years back. I had not thought of ending that aloneness because I had not had reason to think of it. I was a chief. I had a camp to hold together, decisions to make, a people to answer for. That was what I was. That was enough. But I began to find reasons to cross the camp. Not to her lodge. I was not a young man acting like one, but to the places where she worked, and I began to talk. About the camp at first. What things were and what they were called. She knew some of the words. Her mother's words come back to her through years of not being spoken, and when she found one she recognized, she would stop and say it and then say it again, testing it, like checking the edge of a blade. I liked listening to her find those words. I liked sitting near her while she worked and talking about nothing in particular, about the horses, about the weather coming off the Black Hills, about the river that ran near the camp and what it was like in the spring thaw. She did not fill silence the way some people do. When there was nothing to say, she said nothing. I found this restful in a way I had not expected. One evening in the 3rd week, she sat outside her lodge after the meal when the light was going down behind the hills, and she had the little girl in her lap, asleep again. That child fell asleep on her constantly, and I walked past and she said, without looking up, that she had not thanked me. I stopped. She said she did not know how to, exactly. She said she was not good at it. She said she had not had much practice at being given anything. I stood there for a moment. The light was going red and the camp was quiet around us, the good quiet of the end of a day, fires burning low, the smell of wood smoke and the smell of the river. She was looking at the child in her lap and her hand was moving slowly on the little girl's hair without her seeming to know she was doing it. I told her she was working hard for people who were glad to have her. I told her the thanks ran the other way. She looked up at that. She looked at me for a long moment with those level dark eyes that gave nothing away, and then something in them shifted, some careful held thing, not breaking but loosening, and she looked back down at the child. She said, "I keep waiting for there to be a bill." I told her there was none. She was quiet. Then she said she would have to learn to believe that. I told her she would. I walked on, but I stood on the far side of the camp for a long time looking at the hills going dark against the sky, and the thing in my chest was complicated, and I did not hurry it along. The trouble came in the 2nd month. It came in the form of 2 things, which arrived at nearly the same time and were connected in the way that trouble usually is, not because anyone planned it that way, but because one man's greed does not live in only one place. The first was Caswell. He rode into camp on a gray afternoon with a man from the agency and a paper. The paper said that Wickoppy, he called her by a white name she had been given at the road ranch, Margaret, a name that had never belonged to her, was owed to him for a debt of $63, and that as a ward of the agency she could not leave her contracted employment without settlement of that debt, and he wanted her back. The agency man was not a bad man. He was a tired man who believed in the paper he carried the way tired men believe in paper, because paper is simple and the country is not. He stood in my camp and looked at everything around him with the eyes of a man cataloging what he was looking at, and he was careful and he was correct in his manner, and he was entirely wrong. I stood in the middle of my camp, and I looked at Caswell. He had his small-eyed smile again. He had brought a weapon he thought I couldn't answer. The agency, the paper, the government, the idea that he had rights I was obligated to recognize. And maybe in another time or another camp he would have been right. Maybe there were chiefs who would have weighed that and made a different calculation. I looked at Wickoppy. She was standing behind me and to my left. She had not moved when they rode in. She stood there straight and still, her hands at her sides, and she was looking at Caswell with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Not fear, something flatter and colder than fear. Recognition, the look of a person seeing a familiar thing they had hoped was behind them. I looked back at Caswell and I told him that Wickopi was my people. I told him that the woman he called Margaret had never owed him a thing except the work she had already done and been underpaid for, and that this camp did not recognize the debt he described, and that he was going to leave without her. He said the agency man would have something to say about that. I looked at the agency man. I said, "She is Miniconju. Whatever her father was, her mother was Miniconju, and she has come back to her mother's people. That is not a thing that belongs to Caswell. That is not a thing that belongs to your paper. She is standing in my camp of her own will, and she will stand here as long as she chooses." The agency man was quiet for a moment. He looked at Wickopi. He said carefully that he would need to hear from her. I stepped aside. Wickopi walked forward 2 steps. She looked at the agency man and not at Caswell. She said, "I am where I choose to be. He has no debt from me. I am staying." The agency man was quiet for a long moment. He folded his paper. He looked at Caswell with the expression of a man who has been asked to do something and has found it cannot be done and is not sorry. He said he could not compel a woman who said she was where she chose to be. Caswell's smile went away again. He said things after that about what he would do, who he would talk to, what would come of this. I let him talk. When he was done, I said, "You have heard what you came to hear. Ride." He rode. My people had gathered quietly during this, the way people do when something is being settled. When Caswell's horse was small in the distance, Heron Wing stood next to me and said nothing, just stood there, which was his way of saying what he thought. Around us the camp had a sound to it that I recognized, not celebration exactly, something quieter and more solid than that. The sound a group of people makes when they have watched their chief be what they need him to be. I turned and Wickopi was there. She was looking at me and the flat, cold expression was gone. She looked wrung out, the way a person looks after holding something very tight for a long time and finally being allowed to put it down. She said, "You didn't have to do that." I told her yes, I did. She stood there looking at me for a moment and then she took 1 step forward and she put her hands against my chest, both of them flat, and she dropped her head forward and rested her forehead against my breastbone. She did not cry. She did not say anything. She just stood there like that, her forehead against my chest and her hands open against me, breathing. I put my arms around her. I did not think about it. It was not a decision. My arms came up and around her, and I held her the way you hold someone you have decided you are responsible for, the way you hold something you are not going to let the world take. She was small against me. She was also, I discovered, not small. She was full of something solid and dense that was all the years of holding herself up alone, and what I was holding was not fragile. Nothing about this woman was fragile. We stood there for a moment. Behind me I could hear Heron Wing walking away quietly, which was decent of him. She raised her head and stepped back. She looked at me with those level eyes and she said nothing for a moment, and then she said, "I have been carrying things alone since I was 10 years old." I told her she didn't have to anymore. She looked at me for a long time after that. Not the way a young woman looks at a man she is hoping things from, more than that and less than that at the same time. The way a person looks when they have been told something they want very badly to believe and are trying to decide if they are allowed to. She said, "I know." That was all. She said, "I know," and she turned and walked back to her lodge, and the little girl came running to meet her from somewhere, and she caught her and swung her up, and the child shrieked with happiness the way children do, and Wickopi laughed, which was the first time I had heard her laugh, and the sound of it carried across the camp in the cold air. The second trouble came 4 days after Caswell. His name was Archie Flood, and he was a young man, one of mine, 19 years old, good-looking in the way that makes young men difficult. He knew it. He had been watching Wickopi since she arrived, and he had decided something about what the situation was, which was wrong, and he made the mistake of making it plain to her. He did not touch her. He was not that kind of fool. But he said things, more than once and in a particular way, and she had not told me. I found out from Brought Down the Eagle, who had seen and had waited to see if Wickupi would handle it. And when she had been handling it alone for a week and a half, my sister came to me with the particular look she got when she was bringing me a problem she expected me to fix. I found Archie Flood at the horse line the next morning. I'm not going to say what I said to him because this is not a story about a young man getting a talking to, though he got one. What I will say is that there is a way a chief speaks to a young man in his camp that is different from the way two men argue over a thing they disagree on. One of those is a conversation. The other is not. Archie Flood was smart enough to understand which one it was. He was also smart enough to understand that what I was saying was not only that he would leave her alone, but why. Not because I had a claim on her in the way he was thinking about it. Because she had come here and put herself in my care and my camp, and I was responsible for her safety and for the world she found herself in here. And if that world treated her as something owed to whoever wanted her, then what I had told Caswell and the agency man meant nothing, and what she had said, "I am where I choose to be," meant nothing, and she would have traded one kind of trap for another. And this camp did not work that way. This camp did not work that way while I was chief of it. Archie Flood heard all of this. He was a young man and he was looking at the ground by the end of it. He said, "I didn't know, Uncle." I told him now he did. He came to Wickupi himself that afternoon. I did not ask him to. He apologized plainly, without decoration, and she accepted it plainly. And after that, Archie Flood became one of the people who watched out for the little girl who followed her everywhere. And by spring, he was one of the better young men in the camp, which had been in him all along and had needed pointing at. I have found that most young men are like that. They are waiting to be shown the better version of what they already are. Spring came late that year. It came with mud and cold rain, and the river running high and brown with snowmelt. And the camp moved twice looking for ground that wasn't swamp. And there were 2 weeks where everything was wet and cold, and people were tired and short. And the children were everywhere and underfoot and relentless in the way children get when they are cooped up and the adults are irritable. Wickupi fed people through it. I don't mean that metaphorically. She organized the cooking when the regular arrangements broke down in the second move, and we had 3 families sharing fire space, and she did it quietly and without anyone having to ask her and without taking credit for it, which meant some people who benefited didn't even know who they had to thank. I knew. Brought Down the Eagle knew. We did not say much about it to each other because we did not need to. One night in the middle of all of this, when the rain had been coming down for 2 days straight, and the camp had the particular compressed feeling of too many people in too little dry space, I was sitting outside my lodge under the overhang because I could not sleep, because my knee was talking to me, and because there was a thing on my mind I had been carrying for a while and had not yet settled. She came and sat beside me. She did not ask. She just came and sat down on the other side of the fire, inside the overhang, close enough that I could see her face in the firelight. She had her blanket around her shoulders, and her hair was down, and she looked tired the way she always looked at the end of a day. A tiredness that was not defeat. That was the tiredness of a person who had put themselves fully into the hours and had nothing left over, which was a different thing entirely from giving up. We sat there for a while without talking, listening to the rain. Then she said, "Can I ask you something?" I said yes. She said, "Why did you come for me?" I thought about giving her a simple answer. I had several of them ready. I had been preparing for this question since the day I rode to Caswell's post, in the way that you prepare for something without admitting to yourself that you are. But sitting there in the rain with the firelight between us, I found I did not want to give her the simple answer. I told her the truth. I told her Heron Wing had described her getting up from the snow. I told her that was the thing that made me ride. Not pity. I was clear about that because I wanted her to be clear about it, not pity, but something else. Recognition, maybe. A woman who goes down and gets back up without asking who is watching has something in her that most people talk about and few people have. I had spent 19 years looking for that in the people around me because a camp needs it. A people needs it. And when I saw it, I was not in the habit of leaving it to Caswell. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I have been trying to figure out what I am here. Whether I am a project or a charity case, she paused, and then said the word flatly, a woman who is expected to pay back what she owes in a particular way. I told her she was none of those things. I told her she was a member of my camp and a woman who had her mother's blood and had been away from her mother's people for too long, and that was a wrong that could be set right. I told her what she did with the rest of it was her own to decide and nobody's business but hers. She looked at the fire. She said, and you? I said, and me what? She said, what am I to you? I was quiet for a moment. The rain was coming down hard on the height above us. I could hear the camp breathing around us, all those people under their robes, the horses shifting at the line, the low sound of the river somewhere out in the dark. I told her, I am an old man with a bad knee and too many winters on my back. I am not going to tell a young woman what she should want from me. She said, I am not young. I have been working since I was 10. I said, that is not the same thing. She said, maybe not, but I know my own mind. I have had to, and I am telling you that when you put your arms around me that day, I did not want you to let go. I did not say anything for a while. She said, I know what I know about you. I know you are the reason I have eaten enough this winter. I know you told Caswell to ride and he rode and nobody has made me afraid since I came here. I know you sat with me the night I told you about my mother, and you did not try to make it better or tell me it wasn't so bad. You just sat there. You don't know what that was worth to me. I did not know what to say to that. She said, I have never had anyone sit with me in the hard parts. I have always been the one sitting with everyone else. I said, I know. She said, I know you know. That is not a small thing. The rain had eased a little. Somewhere in the camp, a horse made a soft sound, that low rumble horses make when they are comfortable and half asleep. The fire had burned down to a good bed of coals, bright orange in the wet dark, and her face in that light was the face of a woman who had made a decision, and said it out loud, and was waiting without apology to see where it landed. I told her, I am not an easy man. I am set in what I think and slow to change it, and I carry a great deal that I do not talk about. She said, I noticed. I told her I would not know how to make it simple. She said, I don't want simple. Simple has not been my experience of life. I told her, you could have younger. She said, I have had younger men look at me like they were deciding something about me that had nothing to do with who I am. You look at me like you are paying attention. I prefer paying attention. I sat with that for a long time. Then I said, sit here tonight. It is cold and the rain is not finished and you should not be across the camp in it. She did not make anything of this. She did not smile in the way that would have made it something it had not yet become. She just shifted where she was sitting and put her back against the lodgepole closest to me and pulled her blanket around her and looked at the coals and was quiet. I put more wood on the fire. We sat together until the rain stopped, which was a long time, and then she slept where she sat. She slept the way she did everything completely, without reservation. And I sat beside her with the fire and the dark and the sound of the camp and the hills and the river. And I thought about 19 years of holding people together, and about the 2 wives I had buried, and about all the things I had decided I was finished expecting from the world. I thought about a girl who had buried her parents in frozen ground alone at 10 years old and had gotten back up and kept going, 30 miles east of here, and had gotten up out of the snow in Caswell's yard in the dark and kept going, and had come here with a blanket roll that was everything she owned, and had looked at me without hope and without fear and said, where? And I looked at her sleeping by my fire, her face finally still, finally without the watchfulness she wore in the day like armor, and I thought, here. She woke before dawn, the way she always did. She looked at the sky first. She had started doing that, and then at me, and then at the coals, and she rose without comment and stirred the fire and went to the water. When she came back, I told her I wanted to speak to Brought Down the Eagle. She looked at me. I said, if that is agreeable to you. She looked at the coals for a moment. Then she looked up, and there was something in her eyes that was not quite a smile. She did not smile easily or quickly, and I had come to understand that what happened in her eyes was the real thing, and what was in her eyes then was something I had not seen before. Something that had not been there the night she arrived, with her cracked hands and her flat, careful face that gave nothing away. She said, it is. Brought Down the Eagle was not surprised. She had sharp eyes, my sister, and she had been watching us the way she watched everything, which was to say entirely and without making it obvious. She made the arrangements with the efficiency of a woman who had been waiting for something to become official for several weeks. We were together that spring. I am not going to tell you that it was without difficulty. I am not going to tell you that a man who has been alone for 7 years and a woman who has been alone since she was 10 years old come together without any of the rough edges of all that time. There were things I had to learn to say that I had been in the habit of carrying silently. There were things she had to learn to leave to someone else to carry. We both had to learn to sleep through another person's restlessness in the dark, and she had bad nights. Not often, but when they came, she would be up before dawn sitting by the coals like she was watching for something. And I learned not to speak to her when she was like that, but to simply rise and sit beside her, which was all she had ever wanted from anyone and had never been given. She took to the language the way you take to something that was always in you. By summer she was dreaming in it. She told me this, a little surprised. She started teaching the children, and by fall one of the elders, a woman named Kills in winter, who had been sharp with every young woman who had ever tried to learn from her, had declared that Wikapi taught properly, which from Kills in winter was the same as a long song of praise from anyone else. The camp found its own way to settle her into it. This is the thing that I had known when I brought her here that I had not said aloud. She was not a woman who needed to be folded into a shape the camp required. She was a woman who had a shape of her own that the camp would eventually arrange itself around, because that was what happened with people of that particular kind. You did not mold them. You made room and they filled it, and then you found you needed exactly that shape in that place. The little girl, her name was Runs After Wind, attached herself so thoroughly that by the following winter she was sleeping in our lodge as often as not, which nobody planned and everyone simply accepted, which was also how Runs After Wind operated, by fait accompli, by being somewhere so completely that removing her became unthinkable. I am an old man telling you this. I am telling it to you in the way that old men tell things that mattered, not in order, not neatly, because the things that matter do not organize themselves neatly. They come back in pieces, pulled up by a smell or a sound or the particular quality of light on a winter afternoon. The smell of her hair, the weight of her head on my shoulder, the way she would sit very straight when she was thinking hard about something, both hands flat on her knees. The sound she made the first time she laughed freely, that day in the spring mud, because the horse had put its head on her shoulder and blown a great breath into her ear, and she had not expected it, and the laugh that came out of her was the laugh of a woman who was not watching herself, which was something I had worked toward since the day I met her, and had not been certain I would get. I got it. There is not much more to tell that can be told plainly. We were together for 11 years before she buried me, and she did it properly, in the way of her mother's people, which she had learned from Kills in winter, and had taught to the children in the camp so they would know how. And she did not pretend it was anything other than what it was, which was a long grief that was also a long gratitude. She told me this herself, in one of the last winters, sitting by our fire in the particular quiet of a very cold night, her head against my shoulder and our breath coming in small clouds. She said, I am going to miss you for the rest of my life, and I am going to be grateful for the rest of my life, and they are the same feeling, I think. I told her I thought she was right. She said, "You came for me." I said I did. She said, "Nobody ever came for me before." I told her they were fools. She was quiet for a while and then she said, "I know." Outside the fire, the snow was coming down soft, the way it does in a still night when there is no wind and the flakes are large, and the camp was utterly quiet around us. And I sat there in my 57th winter and my 8th year with this woman, with her head on my shoulder and the fire warm in front of us and the snow coming down out of the dark. And whatever I had carried for 19 years of holding people together, all the weight of it, it sat differently in me then. It was still there. It did not go away, but it sat differently because there was someone beside me who knew the weight of it and had her hand on it sometimes and did not flinch. That is what I wanted to tell you. Not a story about what I did for her, about what she was, about what it is to have someone beside you who has earned their way through everything they have and is not asking for softness and is not asking to be carried and is asking only to be seen, and you see her, and she sees you, and the fire is warm, and the snow is coming down, and you are, for the first time in a very long time, not alone.